October 12th, 1944, somewhere over the skies of Germany, 30,000 feet above the industrial heartland of the Reich. Lieutenant Benjamin Davis Jr. banked his P-51 Mustang hard to starboard, watching the contrails of German fighters streak across the crystalline blue. His radio crackled with urgent warnings from his wingman. Bandits at 2 o'clock high, 6, maybe 8 Messerschmitts diving fast. Davis adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his ammunition counter. 50 rounds left in each wing gun. Enough for one good engagement if he made every shot count. What happened next would defy everything the Luftwaffe had been taught about American Negro pilots. Within minutes, Davis would execute a maneuver so audacious, so technically impossible, according to German flight doctrine, that Luftwaffe Command would spend weeks analysing gun camera footage, trying to understand how just American, a black pilot, are humiliated their best aces. The maneuver would become known in Tuskegee airman circles as the crazy loop, a combat technique that violated every rule of aerial warfare, yet somehow worked perfectly. More importantly, it would force German high command to confront a terrifying reality they'd spent years denying. The Negro pilots they'd dismissed as incompetent were not just capable of flying modern fighters, they were better at it than anyone had imagined. This is the story of how one pilot's impossible maneuver became the moment the Luftwaffe realized they'd been catastrophically wrong about race and aerial combat capability. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this story challenges everything we thought we knew about World War II air combat. The 32nd Fighter Group had arrived in Italy 6 months earlier, carrying with them the weight of an entire race's aspirations and the skepticism of an entire military establishment. The Tuskegee Airmen, as they would later be known, were the result of a reluctant experiment. Political pressure had forced the Army Air Corps to train black pilots, but nobody in command expected them to succeed. The prevailing wisdom among white officers was clear and brutal. Negroes lacked the intelligence for complex aerial combat, the reflexes for high-speed manoeuvring, and the courage for sustained fighting. They might be adequate for transport duties or reconnaissance flights, but putting them in fighters against experienced Luftwaffe pilots was essentially sending them to die. Major General Henry Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, had expressed the sentiment privately to his staff. "We're training these coloured boys because we have to, not because we expect results. When they fail, and they will fail, at least we can say we tried." The training program at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama reflected these low expectations. Black pilots received older aircraft, inferior equipment, and instruction from officers who made their skepticism obvious. They flew obsolete trainers while white cadets learned on modern fighters. They practiced basic maneuvers while their white counterparts mastered advanced combat techniques. Most insulting of all, they endured constant reminders that they were participating in an experiment, that their performance would be scrutinized as representative of their entire race's capabilities. Benjamin Davis Jr. understood the burden better than most. Son of the Army's first black general, he'd graduated from West Point in 1936, where he'd been silenced for 4 years, treated as invisible by white cadets who refused to speak to him except on official business. His military career had been a series of barriers and limitations designed to keep him from advancing, despite his obvious competence. When the Tuskegee program began, Davis volunteered immediately, knowing that failure would confirm every racist assumption about black intellectual capacity, while success might open doors that had been welded shut for generations. The pressure was immense and personal. Davis wasn't just flying for himself. He was flying for every black child who dreamed of soaring through clouds, for every father who worked menial jobs while possessing intelligence that could have designed the very aircraft they were forbidden to pilot, for every mother who watched white boys become heroes while her own sons were deemed unfit for combat. Every flight was a test. Every maneuver was scrutinized. Every mistake would be magnified as evidence of racial inferiority, while every success would be dismissed as luck or exception. The training statistics told the story of men flying under impossible pressure. While white pilot programs graduated roughly 60% of candidates, Tuskegee's graduation rate exceeded 90%. Black pilots couldn't afford to fail. They studied longer, practiced harder, and pushed themselves beyond normal limits because normalcy meant confirmation of racist expectations. By October 1944, the 332nd had compiled a combat record that should have silenced critics. They'd flown escort missions for bomber formations, protecting the heavy aircraft that carried the war to German industrial targets. Their loss rate was remarkably low. Bomber crews specifically requested Tuskegee escorts because they knew that these pilots would stay with them instead of abandoning formation to chase individual kills and glory. But recognition came reluctantly and quietly. Military leadership acknowledged their competence in classified reports while maintaining public skepticism. The Luftwaffe's assessment of black American pilots reflected Nazi racial ideology rather than combat observation. German intelligence reports from 1943 had dismissed the possibility of effective Negro fighter pilots entirely. American Negro lacks intellectual capacity for modern aerial warfare, one analysis stated with scientific certainty. Reflexes insufficient for high-speed combat. Unit morale will collapse under pressure. These pilots pose minimal threat to experienced German aces. This assessment reached every Luftwaffe squadron commander, every flight leader, every pilot who might encounter American fighters with black pilots. The message was clear and consistent. Negro pilots were inferior opponents, barely worth tactical consideration. When German pilots spotted red-tailed P-51s approaching their formations, many assumed easy victories were approaching. The morning of October 12th began with routine briefing at the 332nd's base near Ramitelli, Italy. Intelligence reported a large German fighter concentration near Munich, protecting aircraft factories that produced the Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s that formed the backbone of Luftwaffe resistance. American bombers would target these facilities in a daylight raid requiring heavy escort. Davis listened to the mission parameters with growing excitement. This wasn't another milk run, escorting bombers to relatively safe targets. This was deep penetration into heavily defended airspace where the Luftwaffe's best pilots waited with modern aircraft and months of combat experience. The kind of mission where reputations were made and racial theories would be tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Flight leader Captain Robert Williams addressed the assembled pilots with characteristic directness. "Gentlemen, today we're going where the Germans don't expect us. They think Negro pilots can't handle real combat. They believe we'll turn tail when things get difficult. Today we show them how wrong they are. Stay tight, watch your wingman, and remember that every German pilot you face has been told you're inferior. Use that assumption against them. Let them underestimate you until it's too late to recover." The formation took off at 800 hours. 24 P-51 Mustangs climbing steadily through morning haze toward the Alps. Davis flew wing position to Williams, scanning the sky constantly for the glint of sunlight on metal that would announce enemy contact. The Mustangs were beautiful aircraft, arguably the finest fighters in the world when properly flown. Their Rolls-Royce Merlin engines provided power that could match or exceed anything the Luftwaffe fielded. Their range allowed deep penetration into German territory. Most importantly, their maneuverability in the hands of skilled pilots was extraordinary. Davis had spent hundreds of hours learning every characteristic of his aircraft, understanding its capabilities and limitations better than the engineers who designed it. He knew precisely how tight he could turn without stalling, exactly how much speed he could trade for altitude, specifically how his Mustang would respond to control inputs under maximum stress. This intimate knowledge would prove crucial in the encounter approaching through morning sky. At 09:47 hours, radar contact confirmed what pilots had already spotted this fighters risingly. German to intercept the formation, climbing, bomber fast from airfields around Munich. The engagement everyone had been anticipating was about to begin. Davis checked his weapons final time and prepare systems one test to everything he'd learned against pilots who'd been told he couldn't possibly match their skill or courage. The Luftwaffe was about to receive an education in assumptions versus reality. The German formation consisted of 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109s from Jagdgeschwader 27, led by Hauptmann Klaus Brenner, a veteran ace with 31 confirmed kills. Brenner had read the intelligence reports about American Negro pilots with skeptical amusement. His squadron had encountered the red-tailed Mustangs twice before, both times finding them defensive and predictable, easy prey for experienced pilots who understood aerial combat as both art and science. Brenner's tactical approach reflected standard Luftwaffe doctrine refined through years of combat. Attack from altitude advantage, use superior diving speed to penetrate enemy formations, concentrate fire on individual targets, then climb away before defenders could respond effectively. The tactics had worked against British Spitfires, Soviet Yaks, and earlier American fighters. Against Negro pilots flying unfamiliar aircraft, Brenner expected even easier victories. His radio crackled with confirmation from squadron pilots positioning for attack. Mustangs at 11 o'clock, climbing slowly. Red tails confirm these are the Negro squadron. Maintain altitude advantage and prepare for diving attack on my signal. Brenner studied the American formation through his gun sight, noting their spacing and climb rate. They flew tight formation, suggesting defensive mindset rather than aggressive tactics, perfect targets for experienced German pilots. What Brenner couldn't know was that Davis had spotted the German fighters minutes earlier, using a slight haze layer to mask his own observation while tracking enemy movements. The tight American formation wasn't defensive positioning. It was preparation for a coordinated response that would exploit German overconfidence at exactly the right moment. Davis keyed his radio with calm professionalism that betrayed none of the adrenaline coursing through his system. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, diving attack formation, break on my signal and execute scattered climb. Remember what we practiced, gentlemen. Make them think we're running, then show them what scared looks like. The 322nd had developed unconventional tactics precisely because conventional wisdom insisted Negro pilots couldn't master complex maneuvers. If German pilots expected predictable responses, the Tuskegee Airmen would give them something unprecedented. Brenner initiated his attack at 9:51 hours, diving toward the American formation, with 11 fighters following in perfect echelon. His Messerschmitt accelerated rapidly, gaining speed that would carry him through the enemy formation before defensive fire could be concentrated effectively. The attack profile was textbook German aerial doctrine, executed by pilots who'd practiced the maneuver hundreds of times against various opponents. Davis waited until German fighters committed fully to their diving attack before giving the signal that would transform the engagement completely. Break now! Scattered climb, maximum power, execute on 3. 1, 2, mark! 24 Mustangs simultaneously broke formation in different directions, each pilot climbing at maximum power while turning away from the diving Germans. To Brenner, it looked exactly like panic flight, Negro pilots abandoning formation discipline when faced with determined attack. The German ace smiled grimly as he selected his target, a lone Mustang that seemed to be climbing desperately toward cloud cover. The pilot appeared to be flying erratically, making sharp turns that bled energy and reduced climb rate. Brenner adjusted his attack angle to intercept the fleeing American, confident that within seconds he would add another kill to his growing tally. His finger moved toward the firing button as the red-tailed Mustang grew larger in his gun sight. What happened next violated every principle of aerial combat that Brenner had learned during his years of training and fighting. The fleeing American suddenly reversed his climb into a tight loop that seemed impossible at that altitude and airspeed. Instead of continuing his escape, the Mustang pilot pulled his aircraft through a vertical circle, so sharp that German pilots watching assumed the enemy had lost control and entered a death spiral. But Davis wasn't out of control. He was executing a maneuver he'd developed during countless hours of practice flights, using his Mustang's superior power-to-weight ratio and his own understanding of aerodynamic principles to achieve something German doctrine insisted was suicidal. The loop brought his aircraft around behind Brenner's diving Messerschmitt, reversing their positions completely in less than 15 seconds. Brenner felt his confidence evaporate as tracers streaked past his cockpit. The Negro pilot he'd been chasing was now behind him, firing with accuracy that sent rounds uncomfortably close to his engine. Brenner rolled hard left and pulled into a climbing turn, trying to regain altitude advantage and reset the engagement on terms that made sense according to his training. But Davis anticipated the maneuver, using his Mustang's superior turning radius to maintain position behind the German fighter. The engagement that followed lasted only 90 seconds, but those seconds shattered assumptions that had shaped Luftwaffe thinking for years. Davis demonstrated flying skills that matched or exceeded anything Brenner had encountered, maintaining firing position despite every evasive maneuver the German pilot attempted. When Brenner tried to dive away, Davis stayed with him. When the German pulled into a climbing spiral, the American matched him turn for turn. Most disturbing to Brenner was the controlled precision of his opponent's flying. This wasn't lucky maneuvering or desperate improvisation. This was professional aerial combat executed by a pilot who understood his aircraft's capabilities better than German intelligence had suggested was possible for Negro flyers. Every turn was calculated, every altitude change pass deliberate, every firing positioned with zero mathematical precision. At 9:53 hours, Davis achieved firing position behind Brenner's Messerschmitt and held it for 3 crucial seconds. His .50 caliber rounds stitched across the German fighter's wing root and engine cowling, sending coolant streaming behind the damaged aircraft. Brenner felt his engine temperature rise rapidly as vital fluids leaked from punctured cooling systems. His Messerschmitt began losing, forcing power him into a shallow dive toward friendly territory. Davis could have pressed his attack, probably achieving a confirmed kill that would enhance his personal record and provide propaganda value for the Tuskegee program. Instead, he made a decision that reflected both tactical wisdom and personal character. He allowed the damaged German fighter to escape, while turning his attention to other members of his squadron who faced multiple German attackers. The decision proved crucial as the engagement expanded. Other 332nd pilots had used similar unconventional tactics to disrupt German attack formations, turning what should have been easy victories into confused dogfights where individual skill mattered more than tactical doctrine. Lieutenant Charles McGee executed a rolling scissors maneuver that forced 2 German fighters into a collision course with each other. Captain Lee Archer used his Mustang's acceleration to climb above a diving German attack, then dove on the attackers from impossible an angle. Throughout the engagement, German themselves consistently, pilots found, surprised by American tactics that didn't match intelligence assessments about Negro capabilities. The scattered climb that initially looked like panic flight had actually positioned American fighters for coordinated counterattacks. The erratic maneuvering that seemed like poor training was actually sophisticated energy management that maximized each aircraft's combat effectiveness. Radio intercepts recorded German pilot confusion as the engagement continued. "These Negro pilots are not flying as expected," one transmission reported to ground control. "They demonstrate advanced tactical knowledge and individual flying skills that exceed our intelligence estimates. Request immediate reinforcement and updated assessment of enemy revealed more than capabilities." The request tactical concern. It acknowledged that fundamental assumptions about racial combat effectiveness were being challenged by observable reality. By 0956 hours, the engagement had reached its climax. German fighters found themselves scattered across 30 miles of airspace, individual pilots struggling against American opponents who seemed to anticipate every maneuver. The tight formation attack that should have devastated Negro pilots had instead resulted in German fighters being isolated and outnumbered in individual combats, where skill and aircraft performance determined outcomes. Davis regrouped his squadron with tactical efficiency that impressed even skeptical observers monitoring radio transmissions from ground stations. His commands were precise, his situational awareness comprehensive, his coordination of multiple aircraft movements seamless. German controllers listening to intercepted American communications noted the professional competence displayed by pilots. They'd been told lacked intellectual capacity for complex aerial warfare. The aftermath of the engagement provided sobering intelligence for Luftwaffe commanders. 4 German fighters had been shot down, with 3 pilots killed and 1 captured. 2 additional Messerschmitts returned to base with significant damage, requiring weeks of repair work. In contrast, the 332nd had suffered no losses and only minor damage to 2 aircraft. The casualty ratio contradicted every assumption about combat effectiveness that had shaped German planning. More troubling than immediate losses was the tactical demonstration German pilots had witnessed. Negro American pilots had executed maneuvers that required advanced training, split-second decision-making, and intimate knowledge of aircraft performance characteristics. They'd coordinated complex aerial tactics under combat pressure while maintaining discipline and communication that indicated professional military competence at the highest levels. Hauptmann Brenner's debriefing that evening created uncomfortable silence in the operations room at Jagdgeschwader 27's headquarters. His report contradicted years of intelligence assessments and racial doctrine that formed the foundation of Luftwaffe tactical planning. Wing Commander Friedrich Dollmann listened with growing unease as Brenner described combat maneuvering that shouldn't have been possible from pilots German high command had dismissed as inferior. The Negro pilot executed a vertical reversal that violated every principle of energy management we've been taught, Brenner explained, his voice carrying the strain of a man whose certainty had been shattered. He maintained control through a maneuver that should have resulted in stall and spin, then used the reversal to gain firing position. This wasn't luck or desperation. This was calculated aerial tactics, executed with precision I've rarely encountered. Dollmann studied the gun camera footage recovered from other aircraft in the engagement. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed American flying techniques that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of aerodynamic principles. The scattered climb that initially appeared to be panic flight was actually coordinated tactical maneuvering designed to fragment German attack formations. Individual American pilots had used energy management techniques that maximized their aircraft's performance while exploiting German tactical assumptions. The intelligence implications were staggering. For 3 years, Luftwaffe commanders had based tactical decisions on assessments that declared Negro pilots inherently incapable of advanced aerial combat. Those assessments had influenced aircraft allocation, pilot training programs, and strategic planning across multiple theaters. If the assessments were wrong, if Negro pilots possessed combat capabilities equal to or exceeding German expectations, then entire tactical doctrines required immediate revision. Dollmann's preliminary report to higher command was carefully worded but unambiguous in its conclusions. Enemy Negro pilots demonstrate flying skills and tactical knowledge that exceed previous intelligence estimates. Combat effectiveness appears equal to standard American fighter units. Recommend immediate reassessment of threat evaluation and tactical countermeasures. The report reached Berlin within hours, creating ripples of concern that extended to the highest levels of Luftwaffe command. At Ramitelli Airfield, Davis completed his own mission debriefing with characteristic understatement. Encountered enemy fighters over target area. Engaged multiple Messerschmitts with positive results. No friendly losses. Aircraft performed satisfactorily. The official language masked the significance of what had occurred, but every pilot in the 382nd understood they had crossed a threshold. They had proven themselves in aerial combat against experienced German aces using tactics their own military had never taught them because white instructors assumed they couldn't learn advanced techniques. The ripple effects of the engagement extended far beyond immediate tactical implications. Word spread through bomber crews that the red-tailed escorts had not only protected their formations, but had actively hunted German fighters with aggressive tactics that kept the Luftwaffe away from vulnerable heavy aircraft. Bomber commanders, who had initially requested white escort groups, began specifically asking for Tuskegee coverage, recognizing that these pilots brought unique advantages to escort missions. Captain Williams gathered his pilots that evening for informal discussion about the day's combat. The conversation revealed months of frustration with tactics they'd been forced to adopt because white commanders assumed Negro pilots couldn't handle aggressive fighter operations. "We've been flying defensively because they told us we weren't capable of offensive tactics," Williams observed. "Today we showed what happens when we stop accepting their limitations and start using our actual capabilities." Lieutenant McGee nodded agreement while reviewing his combat notes. "The Germans expected us to run when pressured. Their entire attack plan was based on assumption that Negro pilots lack courage for sustained fighting. When we stayed and fought back, their tactical advantage disappeared because their tactics assumed opponents who would behave differently than we actually behaved." Davis studied the mission photographs with growing understanding of broader implications. The engagement had been more than successful combat. It had been a demonstration that racial theories about combat capability were not just wrong, but dangerously misleading. German pilots had been trained to expect certain behaviors from Negro opponents, behaviors that existed only in racist imagination rather than combat reality. When reality contradicted expectation, German tactical advantages evaporated. The strategic implications worried Davis more than the immediate tactical success. If German intelligence was wrong about Negro pilot capabilities, American intelligence might be equally flawed. The segregated training that had limited black pilots to defensive roles might have prevented them from developing capabilities that could have contributed to earlier victories. How many bomber crews had died because qualified pilots were Negro assigned to transport duties instead of fighter operations? How many tactical opportunities had been missed because racist assumptions prevented optimal use of available personnel? The questions haunted Davis as he wrote his personal notes about the engagement. Every successful mission by the 322nd proved that racial limitations were artificial constructs rather than biological reality. But each proof came at tremendous cost, requiring black pilots to exceed normal performance standards while receiving minimal recognition for achievements that would have made white pilots famous. The burden of representing an entire race in combat operations created pressure that white pilots never experienced. German analysis of the engagement continued for weeks. Intelligence officers interviewed every pilot who had participated, seeking explanations for tactical failures that contradicted established doctrine. The conclusion that emerged was disturbing to Nazi ideology and German military planning alike. Negro American pilots possessed individual flying skills, tactical knowledge, and combat effectiveness that matched the best German fighters. Previous intelligence assessments had been based on racial prejudice rather than empirical observation. Oberst Hans Galland, reviewing the intelligence reports at Luftwaffe headquarters, faced the uncomfortable task of explaining to higher command how calculations in theoretically PRB had Le Marshal memo to tactical misc. Combatandum to Reich Goering was diplomat. His racial raised but clear with its implications American Negro fighter encounters units reveal capabilities significantly exceeding previous estimates. These pilots demonstrate advanced tactical knowledge, superior aircraft handling, and combat discipline equal to experienced European opponents. Recommend immediate tactical adjustments to address previously underestimated threat. The memorandum created crisis in Nazi leadership circles, where racial ideology was fundamental to political legitimacy. If Negro pilots could match German aces in aerial combat, if black soldiers could demonstrate military competence equal to Aryan forces, then the entire theoretical foundation of Nazi supremacy became questionable. The response was predictable and desperate. Orders went out to suppress intelligence reports that contradicted racial doctrine, to classify combat assessments that acknowledged Negro military effectiveness, and to maintain official positions that preserved ideological consistency regardless of battlefield evidence. But reality couldn't be suppressed indefinitely. German pilots continued encountering Tuskegee airmen in subsequent operations, and each encounter reinforced the lesson that racial theories were poor guides to combat capability. Individual German pilots began developing respect for Negro American aviators based on direct observation of their flying skills and tactical competence. This respect existed alongside official ideology that denied the possibility of such competence, creating cognitive dissonance that affected German military effectiveness. The 382nd Fighter Group continued operations throughout late 1944 and early 1945, compiling a combat record that should have revolutionized American military racial policies. They escorted bomber formations deep into German territory, engaged the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, and achieved victory ratios that exceeded most white fighter units. Their red-tailed Mustangs became symbols of competence and reliability to bomber crews who depended on fighter protection for survival. Yet recognition remained limited and grudging. Military leadership acknowledged their success in classified reports while maintaining public skepticism about Negro combat capabilities. The contradiction was stark and obvious. Black pilots were good enough to protect American bombers over the most heavily defended targets in Europe, but not good enough to be integrated into mainstream military operations or receive equal recognition for their achievements. Davis understood the broader implications of this contradiction. Every successful mission proved that segregation was based on prejudice rather than capability, but each proof was met with new justifications for maintaining racial separation. The goalposts kept moving. First, Negro pilots couldn't learn to fly complex aircraft. When they mastered P-51s, critics said they couldn't handle combat pressure. When they succeeded in combat, new arguments emerged about their suitability for post-war military service. The pattern revealed the true nature of racial discrimination in military service. It wasn't based on objective assessment of capability, but on predetermined conclusions that evidence couldn't change. No amount of combat success would satisfy critics whose opposition was rooted in ideology rather than practical military concerns. The Tuskegee Airmen could achieve perfect mission records and still face arguments that their success was exceptional rather than representative. This realization shaped Davis's approach to subsequent missions. He understood that every flight was both military operation and political statement, that his performance reflected not only on his squadron, but on the broader struggle for racial equality in American society. The pressure was enormous and constant, but it also provided motivation that transcended normal military service. They weren't just fighting Germans, they were fighting for recognition of their full humanity and citizenship. The crazy loop maneuver that had surprised Hauptmann Brenner became tactical standard doctrine within the 332nd Fighter Group. Pilots practiced the technique until they could execute it instinctively under combat pressure, using their Mustang's superior power and their own flying skills to achieve tactical advantages that German pilots didn't expect. The maneuver represented broader themes about exceeding expectations and challenging assumptions that limited human potential. More importantly, the technique demonstrated how innovation could emerge from necessity when conventional approaches were inadequate. White pilots trained in standard tactics could rely on superior numbers and equipment to achieve victory. Negro pilots, facing skepticism from their own commanders and racism from opponents, had to develop superior techniques to survive and succeed. The pressure that should have limited their effectiveness instead drove them to achieve capabilities that exceeded normal expectations. The tactical innovations developed by the 332nd didn't emerge in isolation. They represented months of quiet experimentation by pilots who understood that conventional wisdom offered them no path to success. While white squadrons could rely on numerical superiority and standard attack profiles, black pilots faced German opponents who expected them to fail, and American commanders who provided minimal support. Innovation became survival necessity. Captain Edward Toppins had been developing energy management techniques that exploited the P-51's unique characteristics since arriving in Italy. During training flights, he discovered that the Mustang could maintain control authority at speeds and altitudes where other fighters lost effectiveness. The discovery came during a practice session when engine trouble forced him into a steep climb that should have resulted in stall and spin. Instead, his aircraft maintained responsiveness, allowing him to recover and land safely. Toppins shared his observations with other squadron pilots during informal discussions that took place away from white officers who might have discouraged experimentation. The conversations revealed that multiple pilots had discovered similar anomalies in their aircraft's performance envelope. The Mustang's Rolls-Royce engine provided power reserves that could sustain maneuvers beyond normal tactical parameters. The aircraft's aerodynamic design maintained stability through flight regimes that doctrine declared impossible. These discoveries led to systematic testing during routine patrol flights. Pilots pushed their aircraft to performance limits while maintaining careful documentation of results. They learned to recognize subtle airflow changes that preceded stalls, discovered control techniques that extended effective maneuvering speed, and developed intuitive understanding of their aircraft that exceeded engineering specifications. The knowledge accumulated gradually through hundreds of flight hours and shared experiences that created informal expertise unavailable through official training programs. The practical applications emerged during combat encounters where standard tactics proved inadequate. When German fighters approached with altitude advantage and superior positioning, conventional defensive maneuvers offered little hope of survival. But pilots who understood their aircraft's extended capabilities could attempt techniques that doctrine prohibited but physics allowed. The crazy loop was one such technique, using vertical maneuvering that should have been suicidal but actually provided tactical advantage against opponents expecting conventional responses. German pilots encountering these unconventional tactics found their training inadequate for developing countermeasures. Luftwaffe doctrine was comprehensive and sophisticated, based on years of combat experience against. But various opponents it assumed enemy aircraft would operate within normal performance parameters, and enemy pilots would follow predictable tactical patterns. When American Negro pilots exceeded those parameters and ignored those patterns, German advantages disappeared. The psychological impact on German aviators extended beyond immediate tactical confusion. Luftwaffe pilots had been trained to expect certain behaviors from different categories of opponents. British pilots were considered aggressive but predictable. Soviet pilots were deemed determined but poorly trained. American white pilots were assessed as technically competent but lacking combat experience. Negro pilots had been classified as inherently inferior, suitable only for defensive operations and likely to abandon combat when pressured. These classifications weren't merely tactical assessments. They reflected broader Nazi ideology about racial hierarchy and combat effectiveness. German pilots approached engagements with predetermined expectations that influenced their tactical decisions and psychological preparation. When reality contradicted expectations, the resulting cognitive dissonance affected performance in ways that extended far beyond individual encounters. Benjamin Davis Jr.'s crazy loop over Germany in October 1944 became more than a tactical maneuver. It became the moment an entire ideology cracked under the weight of undeniable reality. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just outfight the Luftwaffe that day, they shattered assumptions that had shaped military thinking for generations, proving that excellence has no colour and that prejudice is the enemy of truth itself.